What do you need to know about filling in your through-hulls before you start the job? A few tips not mentioned in the directions that you find most places can make a hot, messy job just a little bit better. I'm Carolyn Sherlock, and on this episode of the Boat Galley Podcast, I'll share 16 things you need to know when you decide to do it yourself and fill in through-hulls. First, though, let me tell you about today's sponsor. Today's episode of the Boat Galley Podcast is sponsored by Mantis Marine, maker of the Mantis Anchor, now available in models with and without a roll bar. Proven to set reliably in the most challenging bottoms, the Mantis Anchor digs like no other, making anchoring safer and boating life more enjoyable. Mantis Marine also brings to market practical, durable, and affordable marine products, including their anchoring gear, scuba diving accessories, and a rechargeable waterproof headlamp for hands-free lighting. Visit mantismarine.com and see for yourself. Seriously, I use their products every day and love them. Want a few tips on filling in a through-hull on your boat? Now, this isn't going to be a how-to on the project. You can get great information in Don Casey's The Complete Illustrated Sailboat Maintenance Manual and on the West Systems Epoxy website. Now, what I want to talk about today is all the stuff about filling in a through-hull that either someone did tell us and we found extremely helpful, or the things that we wish somebody had told us before we figured them out on our own halfway through the project. There's a bunch of links in the show notes, and they're all going to be to Amazon to show you the products that I'm discussing. A lot of them are probably new to you. They were to us. But you can get most of those items at a hardware or home improvement store. You don't have to get them from Amazon. Okay, first of all is your protective gear. Get and wear protective gear from the start. Things like a sanding and particle mask, a bunny suit. The Tyvek suits are the best, but one that's breathable may be more tolerable in the summer heat so that you actually wear it. You're going to need goggles. Even if you wear glasses, you need goggles. And you also need gloves. Latex are fine if you're not allergic to it. They're generally cheap and easy to find. The materials for filling in a through-hull are both itchy and hazardous. Dave added actually a paint spray hood when he was doing the worst of the fiberglass grinding to keep the dust from getting around his neck. Get plenty of masks and gloves. We had about 10 masks. That was about right. 15 pairs of gloves. We could have used a whole bunch more. I would get a whole box of 50 of them. Second thing is, if you possibly can, have a second person. You can fill in a through-hull single-handedly, and many portions, such as like the grinding and so forth, are really one-person jobs. But when you start working with epoxy and fiberglass, a second set of hands is really helpful. Second person will be working with fiberglass and colloidal silica, so get protective gear for them too. If nothing else, make sure that anybody who is around the silica wears a particle mask. It's really bad for your lungs. All those N95 masks that you have, yep, this is where you can keep using them. You need a wood plug. If your through-hull is like ours and has a thick wood backing plate, a good way to fill that hole, not the hole in the hull itself, but the extra inch or so through the wood, is to use a hole saw or the appropriate diameter and cut a wood plug that you can epoxy into place. Don't let it intrude into the fiberglass hole of the hull. You're going to use thickened epoxy to secure it. And if needed, just put a screw into the drill hole left by the hole saw so that you can hold the plug. Then, after the epoxy is cured, holding it in place against the other wood, remove the screw and fill that hole with epoxy. Then you can apply a few layers of fiberglass cloth and epoxy on the inside over that whole backing plate. Okay, the next thing to not forget about is the showers. You're going to be working with fiberglass every step of the way, from grinding it to cutting it, applying layers of it to sanding again. The stuff is nasty, itchy, and painful on your skin. As soon as you finish for today, take a cool, not a hot, but a cool shower and change into fresh clothes. Don't wait. At the risk of having too much information, Be careful going to the bathroom that you don't get fiberglass shards on any private areas. It really hurts badly for days. Some people have occasionally had to go to the emergency room because it was so bad. Okay, time. This project, filling 2 Thru-Hulls, took us about 10 days, but part of that was just because we did it in the middle of summer when it was brutally hot and we couldn't work out in the sun more than about 4 hours a day. But some of that time was time that we just couldn't apply too many layers of fiberglass and epoxy in a day so that it would cure properly. Grinding and sanding is hard work too, and cleaning up each day, both yourself and the work area, takes time. It's not going to go as fast as you might expect. And you want to do it right. This is a hole below the water line that you are filling. Okay, how many layers in a day? The books say not to do too many layers at a time due to the heat that builds up in curing epoxy. There's also the weight of the wet fiberglass and epoxy and the fact that you're probably working on a vertical or possibly even overhead surface. You don't want gravity to start making the fiberglass slip. Now, Don Casey mentions holding the fiberglass cloth with masking tape when working on a vertical surface. This created just a monster mess for us, and we found that we were better off with just epoxy holding the cloth. Theoretically, you can do some layers, let it start to cure, do some more, let it start going off, etc., and do the whole layup in a single day without having to do any sanding or between coats prep. We were frankly exhausted long before, and so we had to prep the cured layers from the previous day each morning by sanding and washing with acetone. Typically, we did 6 or 7 layers in one hole, then the same in the second Thru-Hull we were filling in. We took a break, then we did 6 or 7 more layers in each hole and called it a day. Okay, let's go on to tools that we found helpful, tips, and amounts of things that we used. This list is not complete. You'll see other things mentioned in the how-to articles. This is just the extra stuff we wished we had known. First of all is a flap disc. The instructions say to grind the fiberglass out to a diameter 12 times the depth you are going to fill. A friend at the boatyard told us about a great tool to do this. It's called a flap disc, or sometimes they call it a flap wheel that goes on a buffer or sander. Dave first used a 4-inch diameter 36 grit one to get things started, but then he switched to an 8-inch diameter one to finish it. Now, neither Dave nor I had ever heard of a flap disc, and my dad owned a hardware store where I grew up. Check these out on Amazon and, believe me, grab one. Okay, next thing you need is a good sander. Because we had to do the fiberglassing over 3 days, plus a 4th day for adding a fill coat at the end, Dave had to sand the previous day's top layer before starting the next one. Lots of 80 grit sandpaper was used. Now, you can't use the flap disc here. You've got to use just regular sandpaper discs. We probably used maybe 30 discs. Acetone, we used it both to prep the surface each day and for cleaning things up. It took us 2 quarts. It took us lots of rags and blue paper towels, too. Plan to throw the rags out. Don't even try to wash the epoxy out of them. Brushes. We first tried using throwaway foam brushes. Don't bother. They're horrible with epoxy. Use cheap bristle brushes. We used 1-inch and 1.5-inch, and buy enough that you can use at least 2 new ones every day. We also had a squeegee that it was part of a kit. We used it some, but frankly, the brushes were the workhorse of the project. If we hadn't had the squeegee, it wouldn't have mattered. Epoxy pots. If you mix a fresh batch of epoxy in a pot with some left in it from the previous batch that's going off, the new batch will go off almost immediately. Yeah, ask me how I know this. Using a fresh pot stops this, but you can reuse the pots the next day. Just pop the cured epoxy out. The pint mix and measure pots worked well for us and held up. The brand isn't important, but note that some things that are called paint little cans are not chemically resistant, and absolutely do not use red Solo cups. They are totally not chemically resistant. We used 3 epoxy pots, and that was about right for each day's work and being able to reuse them, etc. Epoxy pumps. They are worth the money to get the mix right every time. You just leave them in the cans until the project is done. If you're using West System, they make their own. Some other companies also make their own. Be sure to get the ones that go with your brand of epoxy. Don't bother to clean these up every day, as you'll waste a lot of epoxy. We found that 2 pumps each of epoxy and hardener were about the right amount to work with. Now, your preference may be different, but that's a starting point. It was very hot and epoxy was going off quickly when we were working. Okay, the amount of epoxy. Everybody's going to be different with the size of your holes and the hull thickness, but on a relatively thin-skinned catamaran, we used over a quart of resin to fill 2 Thru-Hulls and the corresponding amount of the hardener. Okay, fiberglass. Wow. Did we ever underestimate how many layers we'd need? We thought at most maybe a dozen, and we ended up using 39 per Thru-Hull. 39 layers. Now, we could only get 6-ounce cloth, not the 10-ounce that Casey recommends. But it was amazing how thinned out it was the minute that it was wetted with epoxy. We used almost 3 square yards of fiberglass fabric on the 2 Thru-Hulls we did. Others filling Thru-Hulls in our yard have said the same thing. They expected to use 6 to 12 layers from what they read and ended up anywhere from 30 to over 60. Okay, fiberglass circles. Yes, I cut 78 circles from fiberglass cloth. Do not cut fiberglass in your lap unless you have several layers of protective fabric between the fiberglass and your legs. A large piece of cardboard is good, otherwise you will get fiberglass in your skin. Now the circles will go from the size of the Thru-Hull to the full circle that you ground out. Don't worry too much about being exact. The fiberglass cloth is very, very loose weave, and it pulls and distorts as you put it on and soak it with epoxy. Fold 2 or 3 layers of fabric together in quarters and then cut a quarter circle. It's much faster and easier than trying to cut a full circle. And don't be surprised if you end up putting smaller circles on top of larger, etc., as you see how the layup is going. A couple of times we discovered we needed to go back smaller to keep things level. And you need a long straight edge. Straight edge that's long enough to span the entire ground out area. Will help as you lay the fiberglass, both to keep it level and to let you know how full the hole is or isn't getting. An old 18-inch metal ruler worked well for us. It also helped when we were doing the final fairing with the epoxy silica and then sanding. And finally, check with your tech support people for whatever bottom paint you use to determine whether or not you need to use any sort of primer before applying bottom paint to the new hull area. Yeah, that's it. It wasn't quite as long as it took us to do the project, but boy did it bring memories back. Anyways, hope you found this helpful. Be sure to tell others about it, particularly if they're going to be doing any fiberglass work. And be sure to sign up, subscribe in your favorite podcast app. We hope to have you around on future episodes as well. Thanks.